Hello, welcome to this expert session in the MOOC Problem-Based Learning 3.0 and Learning Analytics, how to combine. We're busy with week 3 in the MOOC and session with an expert on problem-based learning with expertise in learning analytics is a very nice event at this moment. I'm Olga Firssova. I'm assistant professor at the Open University and one of the developers of this course. And today you will meet Dr. Dirk Tempelaar, professor from the Maastricht University, who will share his experiences and insights in this topic. At this moment, there are no participants in the class, but we'll follow the schedule and make a recording so that this session could be followed afterwards. Dirk, it's a pleasure to have you in this session, and I hope that you will give us some insights on what you think of this combination and how do you see it and what do you experience in daily teaching practice.
Okay.
And so we see one participant. Welcome. The session is already starting now. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the introduction. So my presentation will be quite a short one because, as I explained to Christian Stracker, there is a nice interview available, which Christian, I think, posted within your learning environment. And that interview was taken by the people from LACE. That's a European group of people who are trying to spread the word about the role of learning analytics, not only in problem-based learning, but also in problem-based learning. And I was interviewed for that LACE project, and what I can tell is in fact mainly repeating what I told in that interview. So I would really advise you to see that interview if you haven't done so before, after the short introduction from my side. So the typical thing of problem-based learning is that the actual learning takes place in small groups. And those small groups are coached by tutors. Here in Maastricht University, at least in my school, we combine, in fact, small group education with large-scale education. I just finished my class called Quantitative Method 1, and that class counted 1,200 students. So the problem as a teacher in such a class is how to combine these large numbers, 1,200 students, with small group education. The solution we have is still continue to work with these small groups. So we have group sizes on average about 14 students in every PBL tutorial, which implies then that I have in total 80 of these PBL tutorials. And so every PBL tutorial has a tutor, as in the traditional PBL model, and the main learning takes place in those PBL sessions coached by our tutor. However, my course is about mathematics and statistics, and it's the very first course students encounter when they enter university. So there's a huge diversity in prior knowledge and prior schooling of my students when they enter the courses. And what I do is offer them a technology-enhanced learning environment where, in addition to the learning that takes place in these tutorial groups, they can primarily practice both mathematics and statistics in these so-called e-tutorials. And it's my experience that especially students who are that there are large differences in educational system and high school systems in Europe, and certainly outside Europe. So some students come in my course and are relatively underprepared, quite often are underprepared in terms of the amount of practice and they had done in high school, and other students might even be over-prepared in the sense that some of them might even write the exam the first day they enter the course and don't need a lot of learning in the course itself. So what my digital learning environment serves to is offer practicing opportunities to students who are of the, let's say, underprepared type. And next to offering these students these digital learning environments, I started already a long time ago with collecting data from these digital learning environments and use that data to inform students and tutors about the progress students made in those digital learning environments. Still, the learning, the main learning takes place in the tutorial groups, and the tutor is still the main coach for those students. But since several students, or since a majority of the students also are learning in this digital system, it's important that the tutor is involved in the progress these students make, and the tutor can discuss with the students about their progress or about the lack of progress in these digital learning environments. And so what we did is, in fact, introduce learning analytics already, let's say, 10 years ago, before maybe people use the term learning analytics at all, to really have good feedback from the learning in these digital systems towards both students and towards tutors. Where normally tutors would not know how the learning that is taking place outside the tutorial groups, what the consequences are. What we added to these learning analytics is a very specific type of learning analytics, which is called in the literature dispositional learning analytics, because typically learning analytics looks at log data from learning systems, and dispositional learning analytics adds to that log data some characteristics you cannot find in log data, but you take from survey data. And so typically what we do is have, in the very start of the course, take some surveys in order to find out what are typical patterns of students in their learning process. Again, there is a huge difference between high school systems all over Europe. In the northern European countries, we see that there's somewhat more of what is called student-centered learning taking place. In southern European countries, it's quite often more teacher-centered education. And the differences between these high school systems are crucial in how students start their very first course in university. And so we collect not only trace data, computer log data, but we also collect some survey data, and both then serve the role as trying to help the students, but also the tutors in getting some picture of the student, getting the idea of what typical learning preferences the students in her or his class have, and trying to find out the best ways that the tutor can facilitate the learning of these students. And so it's based on the model that we have, in fact, different types of data. In literature, you call that multimodal data. Direct observations of the tutors in the tutorial groups, where they discuss a lot with their students, supported by computer log data, which is based on what students are practicing in the digital learning environment, and supported by survey data. And the combination of the three is all used in order to try to give optimal support in the students in their first course in university. The typical problem for my courses is that Maastricht University is one of the most international universities, and because of this international character, we get a lot of students in our classes who do not have the best preparation for taking such a first course. There is a huge diversity in prior knowledge, and my course is mainly trying to take away that huge diversity to help students overcome gaps in their knowledge, and to strive that all students have a large common background in terms of knowledge, their knowledge in mathematics and statistics. And so that's where I think the combination of, first of all, PBL type of learning methods where students take the lead in their own learning, in combination with learning analytics, that you provide them all the information they need in order to really being able to regulate their own learning processes. And that's what we strive to do in Maastricht, and that's also my my own research is about. And if you have some more interest in this, it's I'm quite willing to send you some papers, but it's easy also to find out some of the papers we have been written about the research we have been doing on dispositional learning analytics in Maastricht. And that's in short my contribution at your platform. And if there's any questions, please take the opportunity to pose those questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have a participant, so I just check whether this participant, Francis, welcome, can use the microphone. And I don't see it, but please use the chat to let me know if you want to ask a question, and then I'll change the settings. And meanwhile, I have actually 2 points. One of them is on exactly problem-based learning. Maastricht is famous for the way problem-based learning is implemented with the phases through which the groups actually learn and proceed in gaining knowledge, improving knowledge. Do you have experiences with different phases in relation to what analytics are collected, can be collected, and what you can do with them during the process?
Yeah, so in terms of phases, the traditional method is what is called the 7-jump method, where we discuss problems into several steps, several phases. Typically, those phases or those steps are divided over 2 different sessions. So in the first session, students start with analyzing a problem and are just checking to find out to what extent they can solve the problem, what are obstacles in solving the problems. If they encounter any obstacles, then they will connect learning goals to that. And then the group goes its own way because they have defined those learning goals, and they will, in between the 2 sessions, try to solve the learning goals for them. So by individual study, and then they return as a group, and all of them have tried to solve, to work on those learning goals, and together then they are solving the problem. So that's in fact the 7 steps which are divided over 2 different sessions. What we typically do in my courses is focus on the second session. And so typically we would like to give problems to students, but since their prior knowledge is that diverse, we would like to avoid the situation where one of the students stands up and kind of explains everything to the other students, and that is also always a one direction communication, because it's typical the case that, for instance, one student has taken mathematics at advanced level in high school, and other students have taken at intermediate or even basic level at high school. So then there is no true discussion taking place, but there is the one student who is in fact taking over the role of a lecturer. And so to avoid that, we have this so-called pre-discussion now replaced by students working in this digital learning environment. So students receive a problem, and they first need to find out, okay, what do I personally know about the solution of the problem? If I see any obstacle, how can I overcome that obstacle by working in this digital learning environment? And then they meet in their tutorial session, and together they are solving the problem. but the idea is that the prior knowledge of students is already kind of leveled off in the sense that all of them have practiced in these digital learning environments, and their knowledge is at least more at one standard than it was before. And the session that they have is used in order to solve the problem. And so in terms of the traditional PBL session, which takes place in 7 steps, we are especially using the digital learning environments, kind of replacing the first steps, take it out of the session, and then have the session on the last step of the 7 jump. Yeah, that's kind of an answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. This is very interesting and most relevant, and also for distance education, we try to bring students to the same level with preparatory activities, and then we can start a joint activity with them. So just my second, probably shorter question is on the ethical perspective. So do the students give permission for use of the data in advance? How did you tackle this aspect, or what is happening in how much data is still the student own data which you do not use or access? What's the experience of Maastricht?
Typically, if you use the data only in the education itself, that's fine. So that there are no regulations for that. If, as in our case, we are using such data not only for the educational process, but also more for research, we typically have two different. First of all, we have now an ethical committee which will decide about research which is done with personal data. So every year I have to send in my proposal in terms of the type of research and the way I'm using student data to this ethical committee, and they have to approve it. And the second thing is that students need to consent to that. And so what we ask students, if they consent to using their data for several purposes. First of all, to provide them with educational feedback, to provide tutors with feedback, and also to do some research in order to improve the education of the next year. Yeah. It's my experience that I've never had one student refusing such a thing, and that's maybe because of the fact that you ask them permission to give them feedback on their own learning, and there's not a lot of students who refuse to get feedback. And so, yes, we go through those steps, but it's kind of pro forma in the sense that I have never seen a student who refused to give consent, and which would then force me to take that student out of the whole process.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's also valuable and interesting for us. I see a question in the chat by Francis, so I can read it out loud also for the recording. Could you give us some examples of what data you collect and how it informs on the various phases of PBL? So it is related to my first question. So
yeah, so
different phases. Yeah.
So what we we collect two different types of data. So the first thing is we follow the learning of students in those two different digital learning environments. They are doing mathematical. They have a learning environment for mathematics and for statistics. And those activity of students is especially in the first steps of the 7 jump important. And so what we do is inform the students and the tutors about how prepared students are in terms of doing those first steps and finishing those first steps. And so it's primarily supporting in these initial steps. So students need some basic knowledge in order to be able to solve the problem, and the majority of students won't have those basic knowledge, and so we help them in getting access to that basic knowledge. But we also inform the tutors about, okay, which students were able to, in fact, collect that knowledge, and which students were not able to do so, so might need additional help in the learning process. And so that's where this the learning analytics comes in. The second thing is that we are collecting more what we call disposition data, and that's, for instance, data upon the way students prefer to learn. For instance, in the literature, you see the well-known difference between somewhat more surface type of learning or more deep learning. And we know that students who prefer a deep learning style profit more from long discussions in tutorial groups, whereas students who are inclined to do what is called a stepwise learning approach quite often better profit from the digital learning environments. And so also from learning these different approaches of learning can also play a role in supporting students.
Thank you. Thank you. Francis, do you have additional questions, or are you satisfied with the answer? So I think that this is a very interesting and the thing, and the value is really collecting feedback and informing the learners and the teachers about what is happening. So it is also what in famous model of Hattie is meant with feedback. So the students, by their steps, they provide valuable feedback also to their teachers.
And quite often it's a disadvantage of having very large classes, and typically we love to have small scale education. Now we think we have a combination of the two. We have small scale education in the sense that our groups are no more than 14 students, as is very attractive. Same time, since we have so many of these tutorial groups, with learning analytics, we can learn about what learning takes place in all of these groups. And the one group who can profit from the fact that the learning analytics also brings them information about what the other groups are doing. And so learning analytics is a means to have to get impressions from a large scale type of education and to bring that information to a lower level.
So that brings Francis to the question of how do you define learning? So the basic question of all, but in this context, it's also very relevant. Addition, sure, right? Simply clicking activities or downloading resources doesn't define learning.
No. So I'm just writing at the moment an article about what type of learning analytics you can get, and in the literature you see there's a difference made between process data and product data. The process data is, for instance, the number of documents you download, or the number of clicks, or the time on task. And yes, I do think that such process data is not very meaningful. So you should always try to combine it with product data. And for instance, product data is mastery of topics. And so the digital learning environments we are using are kind of test-steered learning environments where students also in every learning step they see small problems and are asked to solve the problems. And what we in fact define as students' mastery is how able they are to solve these problems in the digital learning environment. And that's the most important part of the feedback to the students themselves, but also to the tutors. And so it's not on how active you are in the digital learning environment, what you learn in that learning environment in terms of increasing your mastery.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this elaboration, which gave also, Francis also agrees indeed. Thank you for the clarification. I think that we've spent some good time discussing this interesting topic from also with the experience from Maastricht from approach to problem-based learning, and it will give our learners new input for thought and interest. I shared the link to the YouTube session lays for those who would be who didn't find it in our environment. I want to thank you, Dr. Tempelaar, Dirk, for this session. I would like to thank the participant as well, and Christian Stracke, who prepared this session. Deserve a special thank you today. I will stop the recording now, and I think that we can